Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? This question posed to Jesus from a good young man echoes down through the centuries, revealing a challenge to all followers of Christ. The operative word used by the man is inherit. Inherit. For eternal life is not the product of wealth being transmitted from one generation to the next or one family to the next. If anything, it is the product of a certain sense of detachment from the values of this world. For as Mark writes, Jesus said, "Go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and then come follow me." Read within the context of the first reading from Wisdom, an important dimension of the gospel passage is the challenge of vulnerability for the sake of attaining wisdom. As one commentator suggests, true wisdom often requires us to embrace our vulnerability. Wisdom is not about having all the answers or protecting an image of strength. It's about knowing that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. It's about humbly acknowledging our limitations and weaknesses, recognizing our dependence on God. In fact, the wisest people are those often the most aware of their vulnerability because they know that their strength ultimately comes from God, not from themselves. In the sense, there is a paradox, or as St. Paul in one of his letters says, "In my weakness is my strength." And so that I ask you, folks, to consider, what is your vulnerability today? Is it regarding physical health, or relationships, or job, or studies, where you may feel frustrated and weak, not as strong as you would like? That's where the wisdom is. For much of the past 3 months, I've experienced many dimensions of vulnerability. As many of you know, this past July, I had open heart surgery for an aortic aneurysm, followed 2 weeks later by a procedure called cardioversion to stabilize the heart, which the pulse was over 160 beats per minute. Fortunately, through the dedicated labors of the doctors, the cardiac nurses, one of whom is here today, who's helping out a cardiac nurse, the many attendants, occupational therapists, physical therapists, and finally the cardiac rehabilitation team, as well as the support I received from many of you through letters, but especially prayers. I became less vulnerable. And it was an invitation towards wisdom. But my vulnerable states have offered those opportunities for a broader and deeper perspective of life and death, and thereby inviting me to live more wisely. Or as Solomon states in the first reading, I prayed, and prudence was given me. I pleaded, and the spirit of wisdom came to me. And what is that spirit of wisdom? Well, for one, I have a greater appreciation and connection for those watching on live stream TV, those men and women who wish they could be here, but are not. That's how I felt. I was one of them, watching, wondering, wanting to be here, but not able to. Vulnerable, yes. And what was I learning? I learned to appreciate your sense of absence as well as presence. I grew to share in your vulnerability as you watched, but you could not be here in person. And I value even more that despite your physical presence, you still feel connected and watching and praying with us. Yes, friends who are watching live stream, you are important to this faith community. You are connected. Never forget that. The contemporary writer, Brené Brown, describes vulnerability as uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's that unstable feeling we get when we step out of our comfort zones or do something that forces us to loosen controls. For believers, the perfect example of the relationship between wisdom and vulnerability is found in Jesus. In his life, death, and resurrection, in his ministry, Jesus embodied divine wisdom. Yet, he also embraced his vulnerability, the cross, in the most profound way. Think about how Jesus entered the world, born as a helpless infant in a poor manger. He didn't come with wealth or power, but in poverty and humility, in vulnerability. Throughout his life, Jesus embraced the vulnerabilities of being fully human, and he embraced those men, women, and children he experienced as vulnerable. He experienced the hunger, thirst, sorrow, and even fear in the Garden of Gethsemane. And most of all, he chose the vulnerability of the cross, the ultimate symbol of weakness and humiliation. But in that moment of utter vulnerability, the wisdom of God was revealed most powerfully through the cross, which seemed to be a sense of defeat, but became the source of salvation. In his vulnerability, Jesus showed that God's wisdom transcends human understanding, turning weakness into strength and death into new life. Friends, if we desire true wisdom, we must first willing to be vulnerable, to have that sense of those movements where we feel weak. And where do we find the invitation towards greater wisdom? This means being honest with ourselves and with God about our finitude, our limitations, our struggles, and our failures. As the young man in today's gospel didn't realize this, it means he didn't want to let go of an illusion that we can control everything in our lives. Vulnerability allows us to admit that we need God's grace, that we cannot walk the path alone. And another way of finding wisdom in vulnerability is by sharing it. And that is why it is significant to have a sense of connection in our vulnerability. Through this, wisdom teaches that connection is why we're here. We are hardwired to connect with others. It's what gives life purpose. We are who our people are, the people we share vulnerabilities with, and it creates a greater meaning to our lives. I find this is especially true as I read and watched stories about the victims of the recent hurricanes, Helene and Milton. Through their shared vulnerability, they're not Democratic to Republican, red or blue. They are American citizens in need. They are vulnerable, and they are sharing it. They're sharing their vulnerability of what natural disaster has done. But that's where the wisdom is. If you will, that's where the wisdom of American democracy is. It's sharing in our vulnerability, in our common quest to collaborate and to form a more perfect union. They are indeed united in that vulnerability and that quest for wisdom. To use a poet's phrase, there is a terrible beauty in their shared vulnerability, and they're revealing to the rest of our polarized nation there is more that unites us than divides us. The challenge for us, folks, individually and collectively as a nation, will we find in the vulnerabilities the wisdom of God calling us towards growth in our discipleship with Jesus, so that we not so much inherit eternal life, but are bestowed the graces of God in and through the vulnerabilities of Jesus the Christ.